Georgia, a deep south state with a unique geographic position and varied history. As the last of the 13 colonies, Georgia chartered a unique course through the colonial and early national periods, a relative backwater which would become central to the southern plantation economy, a hotbed of resistance against the post-Civil War Reconstruction program. It would maintain its defiance of federal authority with restrictions on black rights over the coming century, in turn becoming an incubator for the later civil rights movement. Reeling from the effects of deindustrialization, a late 20th century pivot towards services and tech brought economic transformation into the 21st century as Georgia continues its fascinating journey, remaining an influential U.S. state. The area of Georgia has been inhabited for likely 12,000 years or more, with early settlement occurring by around the end of the last ice age. The territory was a magnet for different native peoples due to its unique geography, with Appalachian mountain access in the northwest down to the lowcountry and fertile southwestern Atlantic coastline. Truly a rich and varied landscape. The early Paleoindian cultures would give way to the Archaic period around 8000 BC, out of which emerged the later woodland cultures. These prospered from around 1000 BC to 800 AD throughout the forested region, which stretched right up to the northern border with Canada, encompassing groups as diverse as the later Shawnee of Ohio and Iroquois of New York State. The forest cultures were increasingly sedentary and also became the first mound builders in Georgia. Examples, such as at Kolomoki in Early County, remain to this day, with the surrounding community supporting one of the largest settled populations outside Central America. It's a period which sees the emergence of distinct pottery, varying across regions too, signifying cultural divergence and formation of the early tribal groups, which would endure into modern times. The woodland people's increased organization and embrace of agriculture laid the way for the Mississippian cultures. These would spread throughout the entire region, right up to Illinois in the north, between around 800 and 1500 AD. Their settlements were larger in scale, often resembling small towns, with the population supported by surrounding agriculture centered on maize. This allowed for enough surplus resources to carry out things such as large-scale cultural building projects. Early European contact through the 16th century was largely in the form of Spanish expeditions. Operating from their more substantial bases in the Florida area, the Spanish made many forays inland. This included De Soto's famed expeditions in search of both gold and a route to China, a nod to just how far off their geography still was nearly 50 years after Columbus first made landfall in search of India. De Soto made some of the most detailed records of pre-contact native cultures he encountered, which included the organized Mississippi-related groups which were soon to collapse. These Spanish expeditions likely marked some of the first transmission of diseases such as smallpox, which would go on to ravage the native communities of the region who had no natural immunity. It dramatically reshaped the tribal landscape and power balance through the demographic shock. In its wake, many tribal groups coalesced from the ashes of the Mississippian civilization, creating the more modern native nations we know of today, such as the Creek and Cherokee. This is the tribal landscape Europeans would experience into the 17th century and first period of sustained contact. Due to its location relatively far south from the main areas of early colonist activity in territories to the north, it received little initial attention. British settlers started to arrive in greater numbers, though, into the mid and later 1600s, mounting expeditions from the more populated South Carolina. Their primary motivation was capturing Indians for slaves, of which abducted Creek and Cherokee made up a significant portion of the market. This early trading, including for valuable deerskins, led to more settlement, and in 1732, Georgia was established as the 13th and last colony. This was over 120 years since the founding of Virginia, and its late incorporation created unique conditions in Georgia. Interestingly, it was the only colony founded and ruled by a board of trustees, and for the first 20 years remained without a governor in state. Ruled from London by bureaucrats, it was the only colony to outlaw slavery at the outset, as well as Catholics, rum, and lawyers. The state was the brainchild of English Lord Oglethorpe and named in the honor of reigning British monarch George II. While Oglethorpe initially envisaged it as a dumping ground for inmates filling up English debtor prisons, the government saw it more as a useful military buffer zone between Spanish Florida to the south and their valuable colony in South Carolina. The British fortified areas of the coast and had skirmishes with the Spanish on occasion, most notably at the Battle of Bloody Marsh in 1742, which resulted in a British victory. Due to Georgia being a relative backwater to the colony scene at the time, it saw limited fighting on its territory during the War of Independence as compared to colonies further north. However, one of the few major encounters was the Siege of Savannah, in which a combined contingent of American and French forces attempted to besiege the city and force the occupying British out. It ultimately ended in failure when the French commander, unwilling to stay the course of a prolonged siege, saw his direct assault easily put down by British defenders. Despite the early intentions of trustees in London, slavery had been legalized in Georgia in 1751, beginning a deep and enduring relationship between the state and practice. Between 1751 and 1775 alone, eager planters are estimated to have imported around 17,500 slaves to the colony to grow both cotton and rice in the southeast. These were predominantly first-generation enslaved Africans who brought with them their rich cultural traditions. This inadvertently contributed to the development of a dynamic new culture along Georgia's Atlantic coastal areas especially, leading to the emergence of Gullah culture and dialects which live on in certain African American communities of Georgia to this day. By the late 18th century, cotton was a boom industry, and the slavery-based plantation system flourished in the state. The influx of wealthy plantation owners from South Carolina helped deepen the practice, not to mention the invention of the cotton gin in 1793, in fact on a Georgia slave estate which revolutionized the processing of the crop. This added profit to operations, incentivized business expansion, and essentially underpinned much of the growing slave belt across southern states. This belt included South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. While the majority of whites in Georgia at this time were poor, small-scale farmers and without slaveholdings, slavery nevertheless reshaped the economy and Southern society more generally, as testified to the opulent estates which dot Georgia's old plantation sites to this day. The port at Savannah would also play an important role in the direct importation of West Africans until the ban on the transatlantic slave trade in 1798 by the state legislature. Due to it joining the British colonies later, Georgia's native population had remained in greater numbers than in other states to the north. The Cherokee and Creek particularly were still present in their ancestral homelands, and this presented problems for settlers eyeing the remaining areas of land for development. While periods of conflict had occurred through earlier eras, particularly the Creek War of 1813 to 1814, there had been no concerted government attempt at mass native removal. While periods of conflict had occurred throughout earlier eras, particularly the Creek War of 1813 to 1814, there had been no concerted government attempt at mass native removal. Into the 1830s, however, this would change. Andrew Jackson's Indian removal policy targeted the remaining native populations of the southeastern USA for extraction west to the plains. This infamous episode culminated in the Trial of Tears between 1838 to 1839, which saw tribes across the region, including the remaining Georgian Cherokee and Creek, forced on long and deadly marches west. The Cherokees, for example, were made to complete a 1,200-mile journey escorted by U.S. cavalry, with around 6,000 of them dying through starvation, exhaustion, and disease during the march. The number of dead rose to around 15,000 when including all the native groups expelled. The removal essentially cleared all tribes who remained east of the Mississippi River, freeing up this large swath of land for full Euro-American settlement. Development beyond just agriculture and the sprawling plantations would occur over the next period. The 1830s saw the connecting of Georgia to the rail network, with Athens, Savannah, and Augusta all linked up in this period. 1837 saw the founding of Terminus at the end of this rail system, soon to be known as Atlanta. Atlanta would quickly become not just one of the most important cities in Georgia, but in fact the entire South. It helped drive an industrial transformation of the state, so much so that by the time of the outbreak of Civil War, Georgia was often referred to as the Empire State of the South, largely due to its textile production. In the Civil War, which would sweep across the nation, the state would play an important role. It was a territorially large, deep South state with unique Atlantic coastal access and a heritage as one of the 13 English colonies. Added to this, it also had one of the largest numbers of enslaved people and slaveholders in the U.S. This, unsurprisingly, made it a strong advocate for secession and the Confederacy, but also an ideological bulwark of the Confederate and slaveholding cause. Georgia seceded in February 1861 with approximately 120,000 state citizens serving in the Confederate Armed Forces during the course of the war. It bore witness to the bloody Battle of Chickamauga in September 1863, a Confederate victory which halted the Union advance but also left around 16,000 to 18,000 casualties on each side. This was the worst U.S. Army defeat in the Western Theater and second highest number of casualties after the Battle of Gettysburg. A devastating blow to the state would come with William Sherman's March to the Sea. This military campaign saw Union forces essentially sack their way through Georgia from Atlanta to Savannah between November and December 1864. The aim was to demonstrate the Confederacy's inability to protect its own citizens, as well as deal a death blow to the economy and agricultural sector. Union troops seized about 5,000 horses, 13,000 cattle, 9.5 million pounds of corn, and destroyed railroad lines as well as bridges. All in all, it's estimated the march caused around $100 million of damage. A brutal psychological blow that helped to soften Georgia for surrender as well as the Confederacy as a whole. Georgia would emerge from the Civil War bloody and bruised. Agricultural output had been dramatically reduced, with its coastal rice plantations never to recover. Initially under a short period of military occupation, during which time the first elections were held in which black men could vote. The nearly 100,000 freed blacks on the electoral register of 1867 almost matched the number of whites, creating a radically new dynamic. Interestingly, this period directly after the Civil War was likely the high watermark of African American rights in Georgia for nearly 100 years. This is due to their voting and general civil rights being heavily restricted during the following period of segregationist Jim Crow laws in the South. These restrictions would persist until the legal changes of the 1960s. However, this short period following the war briefly offered a radically different path. During the next period, Georgia heavily relied on the Reconstruction program, with the government providing general economic relief and expanding the railroad network. The State General Assembly was then cleared of ex-Confederates, with Reconstruction supporting legislators reinstated in their place. In 1870, this new legislature ratified the 15th Amendment, and in July, Georgia was readmitted to the Union, the last Confederate state to do so. Into the 1880s, and with the shadow of war fading, Georgia continued a gradual recovery. Cotton production had picked up again, with expertise from places like New England brought in to increase textile production within the state. Logging also became a boom industry, as many of Georgia's remaining virgin forests were eaten up, while coal mining grew in importance, and Atlanta's role as an industrial hub went from strength to strength. A period of relative wealth sustained by these industries followed through the Gilded Age and into the Progressive Era. The Great Depression, however, would hit Georgia hard in both its agricultural regions and more industrialized cities such as Atlanta. As with many other U.S. states, while the New Deal rescue package helped improve their economic situation, it would take World War II and its huge boost to demand to really turn things around. In Georgia's case, it was the Boeing B-29 bomber, produced in Marietta from 1943, one of the U.S.'s most important aerial assets and one which helped push the Georgian economy out of recession. This was also alongside the influx of a huge number of U.S. soldiers for training at Fort Benning through the war, which helped stimulate the state economy. The economic growth period continued following the war, with around 500 new factories constructed in-state within a decade. This included increased rural to urban migration, with more Georgians employed in industry rather than farming. Mechanization on farms would also help drive this trend, with a reduced need for agricultural labor. As with other states like Ohio and Illinois, increasing globalization and cheaper foreign competition would drive a wave of deindustrialization from the 1980s onwards. This created economic hardship with many job losses, and the cycle continuing for decades. Between 1997 and 2005, for example, there were around 98,000 manufacturing job losses in Georgia, most falling on rural communities involved in the textile and clothing industries. However, gradual diversification into services and tech helped soften the blow. Atlanta became a hub for numerous corporate headquarters, as well as a constantly growing metropolis, which would go on to generate a large share of the state's revenue. Its international airport would also expand to become one of the busiest in the world, helping fuel growth. The warehousing and transport industries grew rapidly, alongside Savannah's role as an international port. While agriculture declined in terms of total numbers employed, valuable crops like peanuts and peaches remained big revenue generators, as does the export of poultry, with Georgia the top chicken-producing state in the nation. Georgia remains one of the most historically intriguing U.S. states. Located in the beating heart of the South and one of the first 13 colonies, yet founded and settled relatively late, which gave a different native and European contact picture to other eastern states. Overcoming many challenges through its history, more recently its agricultural powerhouse that has successfully made the transition to incorporate the high-value service and tech sectors into the state economy. Alongside its striking geographic diversity and varied cultures, the state has a lot to offer.